January 1939. Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home, Davenport, Iowa. A 22-year-old graduate student named Mary Tudor walks into the orphanage with a clipboard and a smile. She tells the staff she's there to help children with their speech. 22 children are selected. They're excited. Maybe this nice lady will help them speak better, find families, have better lives. Mary divides them into groups. Some get encouragement, praise, positive feedback. The others? She looks them in the eye and says, "You have a great deal of trouble with your speech. You're beginning to stutter. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Don't speak unless you can say it right." She tells the orphanage staff to interrupt these children constantly, to make them repeat words, to point out every tiny imperfection, to make them conscious of their speech in a way that would haunt them forever. These were normal-speaking children. No speech problems. No stuttering. But Mary Tudor and her supervisor, Dr. Wendell Johnson, were about to give them speech problems, deliberately, to prove a theory. Over the next 5 months, Mary would psychologically torture healthy children, making some of them whisper, shuffle their feet, clamp their mouths shut, creating insecurities that would last a lifetime. One victim, Mary Nixon, said in 2003, "It just ruined my life. This is the monster study, and it's one of the most unethical experiments in American history." Subscribe right now if you want real history they don't teach. Hit that bell. Drop a comment. Did you know about this experiment? Most people don't because it was buried for 62 years. Because this isn't just about one unethical study. This is about how far scientists will go to prove they're right. How vulnerable people, orphans, the powerless children get used as lab rats. And how institutions cover up their crimes for decades. The monster study was never published. The University of Iowa tried to bury it. Even Wendell Johnson's colleagues were so horrified they compared it to Nazi experiments. But in 2001, an investigative journalist exposed it. The survivors sued, and the University of Iowa was forced to pay $925,000 in damages. But money can't undo what was done to those children. Let's go to 1939 Iowa and meet the doctor who thought destroying children's confidence would prove his revolutionary theory about stuttering. Dr. Wendell Johnson was a big deal at the University of Iowa. Born in 1906 in Kansas, Johnson himself was a severe stutterer. He'd struggled his entire life with a speech impediment that made him self-conscious, anxious, socially isolated. But he didn't let it stop him. He got a PhD in speech pathology, became a professor at the University of Iowa, which had one of the best speech and hearing programs in the country. And Johnson developed a revolutionary theory about stuttering, the diagnosogenic theory, also called the semantogenic theory. Johnson's idea was radical. Stuttering isn't caused by biology. It's caused by the way people react to normal speech disfluencies in children. Here's his logic. All young children have speech disfluencies. They repeat sounds, stumble over words, pause awkwardly. That's normal development. But when parents or caregivers label those normal disfluencies as stuttering, the child becomes self-conscious. They try to avoid the behavior. They get anxious about speaking. And that anxiety creates actual stuttering. Johnson famously said, "Stuttering begins not in the child's mouth but in the parent's ear." If parents just ignored normal childhood speech problems, Johnson believed, kids would grow out of them naturally. But if you called attention to it, if you made the kid feel bad about their speech, you'd create a stutterer. This theory had huge implications. If Johnson was right, then stuttering wasn't genetic or neurological, it was learned, which meant it could be prevented simply by not labeling children's speech as defective. Speech therapists could stop trying to fix children's mouths and instead focus on changing how adults reacted to children's speech. It was elegant, simple, revolutionary. There was just one problem. Johnson had no proof. His theory was based on observation and logic, but he hadn't tested it experimentally. So in 1938, he recruited his graduate student, Mary Tudor, to conduct an experiment that would prove his theory once and for all. January-May 1939. Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home, Davenport. Mary Tudor was a 22-year-old grad student working on her master's thesis. Wendell Johnson was her advisor. Johnson designed the experiment. Tudor would conduct it. The setup: Tudor screened children at the orphanage for speech fluency. She and 5 other judges listened to each child speak for 3 minutes and rated them on a 5-point scale. 1 equals lowest fluency. 3 equals average. 5 equals highest fluency. From this screening, she selected 22 children between ages 5 to 15. 10 had existing stuttering problems. 12 were normal speakers with no speech issues. These 22 children were divided into 4 groups. Group IA, stutterers given positive therapy. These were actual stutterers who received encouragement. Tudor praised their speech, told them they were improving, made them feel confident. Group IB, stutterers given negative therapy. These were actual stutterers who received criticism. Tudor told them their stuttering was getting worse, pointed out every mistake, made them self-conscious. Group IA, normal speakers given negative therapy. This is the horrifying group. These were normal-speaking children with no speech problems. Tudor told them they were developing stuttering. She criticized their perfectly normal speech. She made them believe they had a problem. Group IIB, normal speakers given positive therapy. These were normal speakers who received encouragement and praise. The hypothesis: if Johnson's theory was correct, Group IA, normal speakers told they were stuttering, should develop actual stuttering behavior. Meanwhile, Group IB, actual stutterers given negative feedback, should get worse. What actually happened? Group IA, the victims. Tudor told these normal-speaking children, the staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech. The types of interruptions indicate stuttering. You have many of the symptoms of a child who is beginning to stutter. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Make up your mind that you are going to speak without a single interruption. It's absolutely necessary that you do this. Do anything to keep from stuttering. Try harder to speak fluently and evenly. If you have interruptions, stop and begin again. Then Tudor instructed the orphanage staff. Watch their speech all the time very carefully and stop them when they have interruptions. Stop them and have them say it over. Don't allow them to speak unless they can say it right. They should be made very conscious of their speech, and also they should be given opportunities to talk so that their mistakes can be pointed out to them. Over 5 months, these normal-speaking children were subjected to constant criticism, interruption, and correction for speech problems they didn't have. The results were devastating. By the end of the study, children in Group IA showed increased anxiety about speaking, whispering instead of speaking normally, shuffling their feet and looking down when talking, gulping and clamping their mouths shut, a tendency to become less talkative, loss of self-esteem, behavioral changes similar to adult stutterers. Tudor wrote in her thesis, the findings supported the hypothesis that evaluative labeling can influence behavior. In other words, if you tell a normal-speaking child they're a stutterer, you can make them act like one. Johnson's theory was proven. He was right, but at what cost? May 1939. End of the experiment. Mary Tudor left the orphanage. She'd completed her thesis. Wendell Johnson had his proof. Then the orphanage contacted her. The staff was concerned. Some of the children's speech had gotten worse. They weren't speaking normally anymore. They seemed anxious, withdrawn. What should they do? Tudor returned to the orphanage and tried to undo the damage. She spent additional sessions with Group IA children, giving them positive feedback, telling them they didn't really stutter, trying to rebuild their confidence. But the damage was done. None of the children were told it was an experiment. They went their entire lives believing they'd been part of a legitimate speech therapy program. They didn't know they'd been guinea pigs in a psychological experiment. Mary Tudor knew what she'd done was wrong. In letters to Wendell Johnson during the experiment, Tudor expressed discomfort. She worried about the harm being done to the children. But Johnson encouraged her to continue. The data was too important. The study was never published. Wendell Johnson never submitted Tudor's thesis for publication. He never presented the findings at conferences. He never discussed it publicly. Why? Because even in 1939, before modern research ethics existed, Johnson knew this experiment was indefensible. His colleagues at the University of Iowa learned about the study in the 1940s and 1950s. They nicknamed it the Monster Study. One colleague, Franklin Silverman, who later became a professor at Marquette University and Johnson's former student, said, "It was chilling and disturbing, and to think that Wendell Johnson, of all people, had sanctioned it." Silverman noted that people associated with the Iowa Stuttering Research Program compared the Monster Study to Nazi human experiments conducted during World War II. That's how bad it was. Johnson's own peers thought it was comparable to Nazi experiments. Yet the University of Iowa did nothing. They didn't investigate, didn't punish anyone, didn't inform the orphans or their families. They just buried it. Wendell Johnson went on to have a distinguished career. He remained a professor at the University of Iowa until his death in 1965. The university's speech and hearing clinic is named after him, the Wendell Johnson Speech and Hearing Clinic, and operates to this day. Johnson published extensively about stuttering. His diagnosogenic theory influenced speech therapy for decades. He's considered one of the most important figures in the history of speech pathology. And he never publicly acknowledged the Monster Study. Mary Tudor became Mary Tudor Jacobs after marriage. She lived in California. She never published the thesis. She rarely discussed the experiment. But it haunted her. For 62 years, the Monster Study remained hidden. The orphans who'd been experimented on grew up. They left the orphanage. They had lives, families, careers, but some of them were permanently damaged. Mary Nixon, birth name Mary Corlask, was one of the group IIA victims. A normal speaker told she was a stutterer. She spent her entire life believing she had a speech problem. She was insecure, anxious, struggled socially. 2 years after the experiment, she ran away from the orphanage and ended up at the Industrial School for Girls, a juvenile detention facility that was even worse. In 2003, at age 76, she said, "I could never tell my husband about it. It just ruined my life." Hazel Dornbush Potter was another victim. She was 11 years old during the experiment. In 2003, she recalled, "I call that brainwashing. I don't care what anybody else calls it. That's my language. I was wise to it right away, but I cooperated. You know, we weren't in no position to argue with nobody. We had nobody to lean on to help us out." She remembered 22 children being taken from the orphanage for the study. Many were told they stuttered even though they didn't. The orphans had no advocates, no parents, no one to protect them. That's exactly why Johnson and Tudor chose an orphanage. No parental consent required. No one to complain. Vulnerable, powerless children. June 2001. Investigative journalist Jim Dyer, working for the San Jose Mercury News, published a series of articles exposing the Monster Study. Dyer had been researching his master's thesis at the University of Iowa when he stumbled across references to Tudor's 1939 thesis in archived documents. He tracked down Mary Tudor Jacobs in California. By 2001, she was 84 years old. When Dyer interviewed her, she confirmed everything. She said she was now convinced that her experiment had indeed induced persistent stuttering in some of the children. Dyer's articles were explosive. Study broke children's spirit. Doctor Experiment on orphans aimed at creating stutterers. They call it Monster Study. The series revealed the experiment's brutal methods, the long-term psychological damage to victims, the University of Iowa's decades-long cover-up, that none of the subjects had been told it was an experiment. The public reaction was immediate and intense. The University of Iowa was forced to respond. On August 10, 2001, the university issued a public apology. The university deeply regrets the Monster Study took place and has apologized to the participants and their families for the undoubted hurt and embarrassment the study has caused. A university spokesman said that while the standards for experiments were different in 1939, this experiment was regrettable under any circumstance. But the apology also defended Johnson's legacy, asking people not to tarnish his positive contributions to speech pathology over one experiment. The university kept the Wendell Johnson Speech and Hearing Clinic's name. To this day, it remains named after the man who conducted the monster study. The survivors weren't satisfied with an apology. In 2003, 6 surviving members of Group IA, the normal speakers who'd been traumatized, filed a lawsuit against the University of Iowa and the state of Iowa. They sought compensation for lifelong psychological and emotional scars. The lawsuit detailed how the experiment had created lifelong anxiety about speaking, caused social withdrawal and isolation, led to depression and low self-esteem, interfered with education and career opportunities, created trust issues and relationship problems. In 2007, the court awarded the 6 plaintiffs $925,000 in damages from the state of Iowa. That's approximately $155,000 per person, for 68 years of psychological trauma. So what went wrong here? Let's break down the ethical violations. 1. No informed consent. The children weren't told they were part of an experiment. The orphanage staff wasn't told the true purpose. No parents were consulted because there were no parents. Modern research ethics require informed consent. Participants must know they're in an experiment, what the experiment involves, what risks they face, that they can withdraw at any time. None of that happened in the monster study. 2. Vulnerable population exploitation. Johnson and Tudor deliberately chose orphans because they had no advocates, no parents to object, no one to protect them. Modern ethics prohibit experimenting on vulnerable populations, children, prisoners, mentally disabled, institutionalized people, without extraordinary protections. 3. Intentional harm, violation of non-maleficence. The principle of non-maleficence means do no harm. Researchers must avoid causing unnecessary harm. Tudor's experiment was designed to cause harm. The whole point was to see if negative feedback would create stuttering behavior. The researchers intended to damage these children psychologically. 4. No benefit to participants, violation of beneficence. The principle of beneficence means research should benefit participants. Group IA children received no benefit. They were harmed deliberately for science. 5. Deception. The children were told they were receiving speech therapy. They were actually being traumatized to prove a hypothesis. 6. No institutional review. There was no ethics committee, no oversight, no approval process. Johnson was a respected professor. Tudor was his student. They just did it. Modern safeguards that didn't exist in 1939. IRB's institutional review boards now required for all human subject research. The Belmont Report, 1979, established ethical principles for research. Federal regulations, protecting human subjects, especially children. Professional codes of ethics. Psychology, medicine, speech pathology all have explicit ethical standards. But in 1939, none of this existed. So should we blame Johnson and Tudor? This is complicated. Arguments in their defense. Ethical standards were different in 1939. They didn't intend permanent harm. Johnson genuinely believed he was advancing science. They tried to undo the damage afterward. No children were diagnosed as stutterers at the end. Technically true, but misleading. Arguments against. Johnson's own colleagues called it monstrous. The comparison to Nazi experiments was made by people in the 1940s. Johnson knew it was wrong. That's why he buried it. He chose orphans specifically because they were powerless. The harm was predictable and deliberate. Franklin Silverman's take. Most professional criticisms of the monster study are intentional in pointing out that Johnson and Tudor did not intend to cause harm. But they did intend to cause temporary harm. They just hoped it would be reversible. It wasn't. Here's the darkest irony of the monster study. Johnson was right about his theory. The experiment proved that labeling children's normal speech as defective can create actual speech problems. His diagnosogenic theory was correct. Stuttering, at least some types, can be caused or worsened by negative reactions to normal childhood disfluencies. This insight influenced speech therapy for decades. Therapists learned to Not label children as stutterers prematurely. Avoid making children self-conscious about normal speech development. Use positive reinforcement instead of criticism. Reduce parental anxiety about childhood speech patterns. Countless children probably benefited from this approach. So Johnson's theory, proven through the monster study, may have prevented stuttering in thousands of kids. But it came at the cost of traumatizing 22 orphans. Was it worth it? Utilitarians might argue yes. Harm 6 to 10 children to help thousands. The greatest good for the greatest number. But that's the logic that justifies every horrific human experiment. Nazi experiments on concentration camp prisoners, justified as advancing medical knowledge. Tuskegee syphilis study, justified as understanding disease progression. CIA's MKUltra experiments, justified as national security. We reject that logic now. We say, no amount of knowledge justifies deliberately harming people without consent. Modern speech pathology's relationship with the monster study is complicated. Some defend Johnson, arguing his contributions to the field outweigh one unethical study. Others argue the study taints everything Johnson did, that we shouldn't name buildings after people who experimented on children. A 2024 podcast called Stutterology, hosted by people who stutter, did 2 episodes on the monster study. Their take: Johnson was a fellow stutterer who thought he'd found a solution. His recent conversion to general semantics made him believe that changing how we think about stuttering could cure it. He genuinely thought he was helping, but he was so convinced he was right that he didn't consider the cost. The most disturbing detail: some modern speech therapy programs still use methods similar to what Tudor did, pointing out speech interruptions, having children repeat incorrectly spoken words, making them conscious of their speech. The Lidcombe program, a popular stuttering treatment for preschoolers, uses techniques that mirror the monster study's negative therapy. So the question remains, where's the line between therapy and harm? 22 children, 5 months, 1 monstrous experiment. 6 of them were awarded $925,000 in 2007, 68 years after the experiment. Mary Nixon said, "It just ruined my life." Hazel Potter said, "I call that brainwashing." The University of Iowa apologized, but they kept Wendell Johnson's name on their speech clinic. So what do we learn from the monster study? Lesson 1. Science without ethics is dangerous. Knowledge gained through cruelty isn't worth having. Lesson 2. Vulnerable populations need protection. Orphans, prisoners, the poor, they're not lab rats. Lesson 3. Institutions cover up their mistakes. The University of Iowa buried this for 62 years. How many other experiments are still hidden? Lesson 4. Good intentions don't excuse harm. Johnson thought he was advancing science. He was traumatizing children. Lesson 5. We have to remember, not to vilify Johnson, but to ensure we never repeat these mistakes. The monster study happened because one man was so sure he was right that he didn't care about the cost. And 22 children paid that cost with their childhoods, their confidence, their voices. So here's my question. Should the University of Iowa rename the Wendell Johnson Speech and Hearing Clinic? Or does his contribution to speech pathology outweigh the monster study? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story made you realize how recent unethical experiments really are, if you're shocked that this happened in 1939 America, not Nazi Germany, subscribe, hit that bell, and share this. Because the monsters in history aren't always the ones we expect. Sometimes they're respected professors. Sometimes they're trying to help. And sometimes the worst experiments happen in the name of science.